Imagine the utter profound stillness dominating the vast California desert landscape under a cold moonlight. Suddenly, a violent, terrifying roar shatters this entire silence with absolutely overwhelming force. A colossal fireball erupts, consuming everything within its massive radius using incredible hungry heat. This was no freak accidental explosion. This was a deliberate and calculated act of total annihilation. At the heart of the fierce inferno sits a simple wooden coffin, holding an American musical visionary. His closest companion is reducing him to unrecognizable ashes using exactly 5 gallons of stolen premium gasoline. Gram Parsons was 26 years old and burning through his own brilliant musical existence. He was the undisputed architect of cosmic American music during a highly volatile cultural decade. Yet he remained a tragic misfit wandering between conservative country purists and reckless rock stars. Nobody truly understood the terrifying depth of sorrow driving his relentless creative spirit forward. He carried the heavy burden of a profoundly broken Southern family legacy. His profoundly beautiful soul belonged entirely to the raw American wilderness, rather than any polished studio booth. Beside him stood Phil Kaufman, a former prison inmate turned dedicated tour manager. Phil was a ruggedly pragmatic survivor who violently rejected the polite conventions of modern civilized society. He possessed a notoriously fierce loyalty reserved strictly for beautifully damaged outcasts of Hollywood. Their friendship was an unlikely collision of fragile artistic genius and brutally grounded street survival. They operated entirely outside the suffocating boundaries established by the mainstream American music industry machine. Together they found a strange sanctuary, roaming the vast expanses of the dusty California desert. The strange origin of this historical footnote traces back to a very specific afternoon. It was the sweltering summer of 1973, inside ancient Joshua Tree. The oppressive desert heat finally gave way to a chillingly beautiful twilight across the horizon. Towering monolithic rock formations cast long haunting shadows across the violently dry and barren landscape. This rugged terrain represented absolute freedom for those desperately fleeing the synthetic reality of Hollywood. They had reluctantly traveled there to mourn the sudden tragic passing of guitarist Clarence White. The official funeral service was a masterclass in suffocating traditionalism and empty religious pageantry displays. Preachers spoke in hollow platitudes while weeping relatives perfectly performed their socially mandated mourning roles. It was a grim parade of uncomfortable dark suits standing rigidly beneath the desert sky. Everything about the stiff ceremony felt like a grotesque insult to a fiercely independent artist. The suffocating formality completely erased the chaotic joyful essence of the man they actually knew. Gram and Phil stood near the desolate fringes of the gathering, heavily intoxicated by grief. They continuously passed a cheap bottle of whiskey to numb the overwhelming sense of dread. Watching the heavy wooden casket slowly descend into the dark earth terrified the young musician. Gram visibly shuddered at the horrifying prospect of spending eternity trapped inside a claustrophobic box. The absolute bleakness of a traditional Catholic burial fundamentally violated his romantic cosmic worldview entirely. He whispered angrily about the sheer hypocrisy of families claiming bodies they never truly understood. Stumbling away from the depressing crowd, they eventually collapsed near a cluster of twisted trees. The sprawling night sky opened above them like an infinite ocean of freezing white stars. Alcohol stripped away all their remaining social inhibitions and fueled a deeply existential philosophical conversation. Gram looked directly at the older man with a sudden flash of terrifying absolute clarity. He passionately declared that his own spirit could never survive such a miserably cold ending. He demanded to be returned to the ancient desert winds whenever his final moment arrived. Phil listened quietly as the young visionary aggressively outlined his deeply specific posthumous burial demands. There would be no crying relatives wearing dark veils, and no hypocritical religious sermons allowed. There would be no frozen graveyard in New Orleans suffocating his remains beneath damp soil. Gram insisted his physical body must be brought back to this exact sacred desert sanctuary. He wanted his flesh consumed by a massive purifying fire beneath the infinite cosmic sky. The tour manager recognized the profound desperate sincerity hiding behind the slurred drunken musical rambling. Right there upon the cooling desert dirt, the two unlikely brothers forged a solemn pact. They swore a sacred blood oath against the deeply oppressive nature of traditional American funerals. If either man tragically perished, the survivor was strictly obligated to steal the deceased corpse. The stolen body would be transported to Joshua Tree and given a proper fiery cremation. They clinked their cheap glass bottle against the ancient rocks to seal the ridiculous promise. To anyone else walking past, it sounded like the meaningless bravado of heavily intoxicated fools. Nobody could have possibly imagined the absolute grim devotion hiding beneath that dark, humorous pledge. Gram Parsons was unknowingly mapping out the exact bizarre coordinates of his own impending funeral. The universe was already setting the tragic stage for their wild desert promise to manifest. The young visionary had only a few chaotic weeks left to wander this dusty earth. His inevitable sudden demise would soon force his grizzled friend to make a terrifying decision. But what happened next would be mythologized in the underground rock scene for 50 years. September of 1973 brought the soaring music to a violent and tragic halt. Gram Parsons was found completely unresponsive inside a dusty room at the Joshua Tree Inn. He was only 26 years old at the time. A lethal and accidental cocktail of morphine and tequila had finally stopped his weary heart. The harsh desert he loved so fiercely had ultimately claimed him forever. He had always felt most alive, surrounded by those ancient and towering rock formations. Now his body lay terribly cold under the brutal California sun. Local authorities moved quickly to secure the bleak and quiet scene. The grim news trickled out slowly to a completely shocked music industry. A brilliantly chaotic light had been abruptly extinguished far too early. Then the cold and unforgiving machinery of his biological family abruptly took over. Gram had spent his adult years running desperately away from his wealthy southern lineage. He deeply despised the suffocating expectations imposed by his estranged and controlling stepfather. Yet sudden death instantly stripped him of his fiercely guarded personal independence. His distant relatives swooped in armed with legal documents and absolute authority. They swiftly claimed total ownership of the eccentric son they hardly ever understood. The wild rebel who proudly wore elaborate rhinestone suits was suddenly reduced to property. The American legal system sided entirely with biological bloodlines over chosen spiritual bonds. The state officially recognized the absent family as the sole rightful custodians. Their immediate and undeniable plan was to ship his body back to Louisiana. They aggressively demanded a private and closed funeral in the damp chill of New Orleans. The mainstream media blindly painted this as a beautifully dignified return home. It was easily sold as a heartwarming narrative of forgiveness and traditional closure. But to the outcasts who actually knew him well, it was a grotesque betrayal. New Orleans merely represented a grim place of dark and generational family secrets. Gram had explicitly hated the terrifying idea of rotting in that wet ground. He spiritually belonged entirely to the arid and lawless freedom of the western desert. Transporting him back east was a cruel and calculated erasure of his chosen identity. Phil Kaufman watched this bureaucratic hijacking unfold with mounting and profoundly bitter disgust. He clearly saw the sickening hypocrisy of the conservative people actively involved. Men who never once supported Gram's wild musical vision were now eagerly orchestrating his exit. Cold industry executives and estranged relatives were quietly shaking hands in hospital hallways. They were actively turning a cosmic cowboy into a sanitized and highly respectable asset. A traditional and proper burial meant shoving his vibrant soul into a suffocating wooden box. He would surely be buried wearing a conservative suit he would have absolutely hated. It was the exact horrifying nightmare they had sworn aloud to prevent. The vivid memory of their drunken pact at Cap Rock burned intensely inside Phil. The rigid and uncaring system had neatly boxed up a free spirit for commercial shipping. Everything unfolding was perfectly legal and socially proper, but entirely and fundamentally wrong. Would anyone actually have the absolute nerve to challenge the American legal system? Most normal friends would simply grieve in silence and let the machinery win. They would stand obediently by a muddy grave in New Orleans and weep quietly. But what happened next would become one of the most legendary acts of defiance. This unbearable grief quickly mutated into a blinding and furiously protective loyalty. The yellow freight ticket to Louisiana was officially booked and fully paid for. The heavy wooden casket was already moving slowly toward the busy airport terminal. The final clock on Gram's bodily freedom was ticking down dangerously fast. The Los Angeles International Airport cargo terminal never sleeps. Jet fuel fumes mixed with the thick California smog. Phil Kaufman needed a vehicle for a very specific mission. He borrowed a battered 1953 Cadillac hearse from a friend. The rusted metal monster lacked any functioning air conditioning. It also lacked standard license plates or proper registration. Phil tossed his assistant Michael Martin into the passenger seat. They brought a massive cooler packed with cheap domestic beer. They also carried a half-empty bottle of strong Kentucky whiskey. Liquid courage was absolutely essential for this insane federal crime. They chugged the alcohol while navigating the chaotic interstate highway. The grief over Gram Parsons morphed into pure adrenaline. Phil was a 38-year-old road manager with a wild reputation. Michael was just trying to keep his own hands steady. They pulled into the brightly lit LAX cargo loading zone. The massive commercial planes roared aggressively overhead in the dark. Hundreds of workers moved heavy wooden crates on steel forklifts. Nobody paid attention to the two disheveled men smelling like alcohol. They parked the rusted Cadillac near the main logistics office. Legitimate mortuary workers usually wear crisp dark suits and ties. Phil and Michael wore dirty jeans and faded casual t-shirts. They looked more like roadies than respectable funeral home directors. Phil wiped the sweat from his forehead and stepped outside. He told Michael to keep the engine running just in case. The heavy glass door of the cargo office swung open. The fluorescent lights inside buzzed with an irritating mechanical hum. A bored cargo clerk sat behind a tall metal counter. He stared at a massive stack of international shipping manifests. Phil approached the desk with terrifyingly aggressive false confidence. He demanded the immediate release of Gram Parsons and his remains. He claimed the family suddenly changed the official funeral arrangements. The clerk looked at the two men with deep suspicion. He pointed out their complete lack of proper identification documents. He also mentioned the extremely unusual nature of this request. The casket was already scheduled for a flight to Louisiana. Releasing human remains required a mountain of strict federal paperwork. Phil slammed his fist hard onto the cold metal counter. He yelled at the clerk with pure theatrical, furious anger. He claimed the airline was ruining a sacred grieving process. He threatened massive lawsuits and terrible public relations media disasters. The poor clerk simply wanted to finish his miserable late shift. The sheer volume of Phil and his anger completely overwhelmed the room. Michael watched the entire performance from the glass window outside. He gripped the steering wheel of the hearse in sheer terror. Phil grabbed a random clipboard from the cluttered front desk. He demanded the official release forms right that very second. Here is where the situation became truly unhinged. An official Los Angeles Police Department cruiser slowly pulled up. Two uniformed officers stepped out into the humid night air. They walked directly toward the illegally parked, rusted vintage hearse. Michael froze completely in the driver's seat of the Cadillac. The police officers walked past the car into the office. They stood right behind Phil at the cargo manifest counter. The stench of cheap beer on Phil was completely undeniable. A single wrong word would mean immediate federal prison time. Phil did not panic or lower his extremely loud voice. He actually turned and nodded at the two armed officers. He continued screaming at the clerk about terrible customer service. The cops assumed this loud man was just a grieving relative. They silently watched the exhausted clerk finally hand over the documents. Phil grabbed a cheap plastic pen from the messy desk. He forged a completely fake signature on the federal release form. He signed it as an employee of a non-existent funeral home. The police officers literally watched him commit a serious federal felony. The defeated clerk finally stamped the paperwork with red ink. He signaled a forklift driver out in the massive warehouse. A heavy wooden shipping crate slowly rolled toward the loading dock. Inside that plain wooden box was the legendary Gram Parsons. Phil confidently walked out of the office past the police. He directed the forklift driver toward the open back doors. The heavy wooden box slid roughly into the rusted hearse. The suspension of the old Cadillac groaned under the sudden weight. The operation was somehow actually working against all logical odds. Phil climbed back into the passenger seat beside pale Michael. He casually tossed the forged federal documents onto the dashboard. He ordered Michael to put the heavy car in gear. The rusted hearse slowly rolled away from the cargo bay. The police officers did not even bother to look back. Phil cracked open another cold beer to celebrate the moment. They had successfully stolen a human body from an international airport. The bright lights of Los Angeles faded in their rearview mirror. The dark and empty desert highway was now calling their names. The heavy wooden coffin slid awkwardly into the rusted old hearse. Metal scraped loudly against metal beneath the glaring airport security lights. Michael wiped cold sweat from his thoroughly pale and trembling forehead. Phil simply grunted while pushing the heavy casket further inside the vehicle. They had actually managed to steal a legendary American rock star. The sheer absurdity of this moment hung heavily in the humid air. But their daring heist was absolutely far from being completely over. Suddenly, flashing red lights painted the dirty windshield with pure panic. A Los Angeles airport police cruiser blocked their only exit path. A stern officer stepped out with his heavy hand on his belt. What would they say if forced to open the wooden casket? Would they confess to stealing their best friend from his family? The penalty for this bizarre crime remained completely unknown to them. The officer tapped his large flashlight aggressively against the driver window. Michael froze entirely, his knuckles turning white on the steering wheel. This was the exact moment their wild desert trip could end. Here's where it gets interesting regarding Phil and his bold attitude. Most people would easily crumble under this immense and terrifying legal pressure. They would stammer nervously and eventually confess to the whole crazy scheme. Phil rolled down the dirty window with a look of pure annoyance. Before the cop could even speak, Phil aggressively yelled at the man. He barked about being terribly late for a highly important funeral service. He complained loudly about the absolutely terrible traffic around the airport terminal. He demanded the stunned officer move his police cruiser out of the way. His overwhelming arrogance completely shattered the standard protocol of the confused policeman. The completely stunned officer actually took a step back from the hearse. He awkwardly apologized for delaying their incredibly important and urgent funeral schedule. The police cruiser slowly backed away, safely clearing the path to the highway. Phil rolled the window up and instantly grabbed another cold alcoholic beverage. He looked back at the large wooden coffin and smiled a wicked smile. They had successfully bluffed their way past the Los Angeles airport police. The rusted hearse lurched forward onto the dark and entirely empty asphalt. The chaotic energy of the sprawling city quickly faded into the distance. This is where the classic American road trip truly began for them. They merged onto the vast interstate, heading straight toward the open desert. The glowing neon lights of Los Angeles slowly vanished in the rearview mirror. Ahead of them lay the intimidating emptiness of the California Badlands tonight. The rattling engine hummed a gritty soundtrack for this final journey. Inside the wooden box, a legendary country rock pioneer rode in silence. They were driving desperately toward the sacred sandy grounds of Joshua Tree. There was no turning back to standard civilization after this wild escape. The solemn promise made under the desert stars demanded to be fully honored. This stolen vehicle carried the incredibly heavy burden of ultimate masculine loyalty. The cool night air rushed through the completely broken car windows. Every single mile marker pushed them further away from normal society. The great American spirit of absolute rebellion fueled every passing mile. They were finally bringing their best friend home to the sands. The rusted hearse finally abandoned the manic energy of the California highway system entirely. It slowly crawled into the sprawling darkness of the ancient Joshua Tree National Park. The chaotic adrenaline from their audacious airport heist immediately began evaporating into the cold air. Phil Kaufman and Michael Martin drove silently through the terrifyingly vast and empty wilderness. There were no sirens wailing behind them across the completely deserted desert dirt roads. They had successfully transported their stolen musical genius back to his favorite sacred sanctuary. The suffocating rules of civilized society simply did not exist out here among the rocks. They navigated the battered vehicle toward the towering monolithic formation known locally as Cap Rock. The jagged shadows of twisted trees stretched across the barren earth like skeletal fingers. This was the exact desolate spot where their drunken cosmic pact had been originally forged. The two exhausted men parked the heavy hearse right beneath the massive stone monument. They physically struggled to drag the heavy wooden casket out onto the dry desert floor. Every single movement echoed loudly against the absolutely deafening silence of the surrounding wilderness. The crushing reality of their deeply illegal undertaking suddenly felt overwhelmingly heavy and undeniable. They stood breathing heavily beside the ornate wooden box containing their brilliant fallen friend. Phil carefully retrieved a massive plastic container holding 5 full gallons of stolen gasoline. He methodically unscrewed the tight plastic cap with trembling hands and a heavy heart. The pungent chemical smell of raw fuel quickly overpowered the crisp natural desert breeze. He began pouring the highly flammable liquid directly over the polished surface of the coffin. The clear liquid splashed heavily against the expensive wood, intended for a traditional underground burial. But here is where the entire emotional trajectory of the night suddenly shifted completely. Every lingering trace of their chaotic drunken comedy vanished into the freezing midnight atmosphere. Phil Kaufman struck a single thin wooden match against the rough side of the box. He gently tossed the tiny flickering orange flame directly onto the gasoline-soaked wooden casket. The resulting violent explosion instantly shattered the profound tranquility of the sleeping natural environment. A colossal, brilliant fireball aggressively punched a massive hole straight into the dark, starry sky. The violently roaring flames immediately illuminated the ancient geological formations with intense, blinding yellow light. Thick black smoke aggressively billowed upward toward the infinite canopy of freezing white desert stars. The raw heat violently pushed the two grieving men backward against the cold desert dirt. Phil stood completely paralyzed while watching the blistering inferno violently consume his closest companion. This roaring pyre represented the ultimate tragic conclusion to a profoundly beautiful artistic brotherhood. There was absolutely nothing funny or rebellious about watching your chosen family turn into ash. The hardened road manager finally allowed himself to fully process the devastating weight of loss. Tears silently reflected the dancing orange flames across his deeply weathered and exhausted face. He had successfully rescued Gram Parsons from a miserable eternity trapped inside damp Louisiana soil. This blazing inferno was a fiercely defiant monument built for an uncompromising cosmic musical pioneer. The crackling fire sounded exactly like the distorted electric guitars Gram had always deeply loved. It was a brutally honest farewell, completely devoid of any hypocritical religious pageantry or speeches. The massive pillar of fire demanded absolute respect from the terrifyingly vast and indifferent universe. They stood together, silently honoring the blazing physical manifestation of a truly untamable human spirit. This was the specific wild departure a beautifully damaged rock star had so desperately demanded. Suddenly, the flashing blue lights of approaching police cruisers appeared across the distant dark horizon. The massive glowing beacon had inevitably attracted the unwanted attention of local park law enforcement. Phil cast one final lingering look at the magnificent bonfire roaring against the desert stones. He knew they had to abandon the burning casket immediately before the authorities finally arrived. The two outlaws scrambled frantically back into the empty hearse to begin their chaotic escape. They sped away, leaving their fallen brother permanently merged with the ancient California wilderness forever. The eternal flame continued burning brightly behind them as a legendary symbol of true loyalty. The massive desert fire eventually burned down into quiet and smoking ash. The blazing inferno slowly faded into the cool and dark California night. Local police quickly tracked down the two exhausted and heavily intoxicated fugitives. Phil and Michael were finally arrested after their wild and chaotic escape. The aggressive media eagerly anticipated a highly sensational and brutal criminal trial. Everyone expected severe prison time for this seemingly horrific and shocking act. The angry public loudly demanded absolute justice for the grieving biological family. How could they possibly escape the heavy and crushing wrath of the law? But what happened next will probably surprise you more than the fire. The rigid American justice system suddenly hit a massive and unexpected wall. Furious prosecutors eagerly scoured the thick and dusty California penal code books. They desperately searched for a major felony charge to completely destroy Phil. The outraged biological family demanded swift and absolute vengeance for the desecration. Lawyers fully prepared to throw the heavy book at these desert outlaws. They confidently walked into court expecting a very quick and easy conviction. They wanted to lock these crazy road managers away for several decades. Instead, they discovered a completely hilarious and truly absurd legal blind spot. During the early 70s, California possessed absolutely no laws against stealing bodies. A deceased human form technically held zero monetary value within the courts. You simply cannot be charged with grand theft for taking dead remains. The overly complicated legal machinery suddenly found itself completely and utterly powerless. There was absolutely no legal precedent for this bizarre act of loyalty. The frustrated district attorney was literally pulling his hair out in anger. The entire courtroom situation rapidly devolved into a massive and humiliating joke. The deeply embarrassed authorities were forced to improvise a remarkably pathetic solution. Did they successfully charge him with a grand act of morbid terrorism? No, they merely charged him with stealing a very cheap wooden box. The powerful state essentially reduced Gram Parsons to a damaged shipping container. The stolen highway vehicle was quietly returned without any further legal escalation. The grand and poetic desert ritual was legally downgraded to petty vandalism. It was a brilliantly satirical conclusion to a profoundly anti-establishment road trip. The strict legal system had accidentally protected the most rebellious act imaginable. Phil Kaufman calmly walked into the courtroom and faced the furious judge. He proudly admitted his guilt without showing a single ounce of regret. The judge officially fined him a mere $750. He also had to legally reimburse the family for the ruined casket. Loyal friends threw a lively benefit concert to easily pay the fines. The ultimate act of wild rebellion was punished like a simple misdemeanor. Gram successfully avoided Louisiana, while Phil casually walked away completely financially unscathed. This bizarre legal loophole forever cemented their wild and legendary desert pact. The morning papers predictably painted the desert incident as a gruesome act of drunken vandalism. Corporate executives sitting in sterile boardrooms saw only the destruction of a valuable commercial asset. Gram Parsons was suddenly worth far more in his tragic death than in his chaotic life. Record labels frantically rushed to package his unfinished recordings into highly profitable posthumous memorial albums. They desperately wanted to bury him under a neat marble stone to sell a romanticized legend. The entire music machinery immediately moved to completely erase his beautiful and wildly unpredictable artistic existence. His estranged biological family simply played their assigned roles in this grand and hollow commercial production. They demanded a traditional Southern funeral that directly contradicted everything the young radical artist represented. Gram was always the ultimate misfit, wandering aimlessly through a rigidly structured American musical landscape. He boldly wore rhinestone suits covered in marijuana leaves while playing traditional conservative country venues. The corporate managers never truly understood how to market a brilliant man who completely defied categorization. But the real secret is that the violent desert cremation was the ultimate act of protection. Phil Kaufman understood exactly what the greedy music industry intended to do with his dead friend. He knew the suits would instantly transform Gram into a profitable and completely silent consumer product. They would erase his wild independence to sell a carefully manufactured version of his musical legacy. Stealing that wooden box was a desperate rebellion against a profoundly exploitative and soulless corporate machine. Polite society looked at the charred remains in Joshua Tree and saw a horrific and unforgivable desecration. They completely failed to recognize the profound and almost terrifying depth of this unconventional brotherhood. Phil willingly sacrificed his own freedom and reputation to honor a drunken promise made between outsiders. There was absolutely nothing respectful about a cold corporate funeral dictated by distant and estranged relatives. True reverence sometimes requires committing a bizarre federal felony in the middle of the lonely night. This was a dark and twisted declaration of absolute loyalty in a notoriously disloyal entertainment industry. The faithful road manager performed the final and most important logistical duty of his entire career. He successfully delivered his artists to the exact sacred destination they had explicitly chosen together beforehand. That massive blinding fireball illuminating the silent California desert was a deliberately unmarketable and wild farewell. It was a raw and chaotic departure that could never be packaged onto a vinyl record. The hungry flames consumed the physical shell before corporate vultures could monetize his helpless corpse. The vast emptiness of Joshua Tree provided a cathedral that no expensive funeral home could replicate. This blazing desert inferno was the perfect final chord for a tragically short and explosive life. It mirrored the exact way Gram lived, by burning incredibly brightly and fading away far too quickly. The thick black smoke drifting across the starry western sky became his ultimate and pure unrecorded masterpiece. This bizarre heist permanently cemented his status as a magnificent outsider beyond strict corporate control. His scattered ashes became forever intertwined with the ancient rocks and harsh sand of the American West. The greedy industry executives eventually sold their records but never truly captured his untamed wild spirit. Phil bravely ensured that the final chapter of this tragic story belonged strictly and exclusively to the misfits. They transformed a depressing legal battle over human remains into an eternal and inspiring myth of absolute freedom. That roaring desert fire remains a powerful testament to living entirely on your own stubborn terms. Some sacred promises are simply far too important to abandon to the cold bureaucracy of modern commercialized death. In the end, this desert heist transcends a simple drunken promise. It stands as a profound testament to raw American brotherhood. Phil Kaufman did not just steal a cold wooden box. He rescued his closest companion from a highly hollow farewell. He boldly returned a restless wanderer to the sacred earth. Gram Parsons was a complete misfit among traditional establishment figures. He desperately needed an exit matching his incredibly wild spirit. This story captures anyone who deeply values true personal freedom. It shows the extreme lengths a real friend will go. True brotherhood often requires stepping outside the boundaries of society. Phil willingly risked his own future to honor their vision. But the real secret is how this reflects his legacy. The rigid legal system only charged him for a box. They failed to understand the heavy weight of his mission. Gram lived his life fighting strict corporate music industry rules. His blazing funeral fire became his ultimate act of rebellion. The conservative establishment wanted to lock him in cold ground. Instead, his essence scattered wildly across the Joshua Tree winds. They bought his eternal artistic freedom for $700. Phil paid that ridiculous court fine with immense personal pride. That was always the true price of a sacred promise. What happened next firmly cemented their legend in rock history. This burning desert folklore still violently divides the music world. Some critics view it as an insult to family values. Others celebrate it as the highest form of unconditional friendship. You must decide how to judge this controversial historical event. Was this a crime against a family wanting traditional burial? Or do you think Phil was the greatest friend ever? Tell me your exact thoughts down in the comments section. Remember to like this video for more crazy music stories. Make sure to check out our other dark Hollywood mysteries.